差唔多啦，係咪啊？係咪啊？大家咧就係請盡快翻埋座位。我最中意做呢個角色㗎，不過都要冇辦法啦，為咗大會。叮叮叮，叮叮叮。叮叮叮！
哇！各位朋友，時間到啦，嗱聲叫門口嗰啲快啲翻入嚟啊！嗱，佔領中環講時間㗎，差1分鐘都唔得，佔領唔到㗎啦。下1分鐘就佔領上環㗎啦。係啊，快啲，坐低。快啲！
非暴力訓練營咧，裏邊咧，
快啲外面嘅朋友。
有冇講題嘅呢樣嘢 ？discipline。
好，門口嘅朋友，請外面嘅朋友盡快翻入嚟啊！
因為咧，我哋時間唔多，但係咧就係我知道Nicole咧已經係準備咗咧係2個嘅同我哋玩嘅exercise，令我哋係可以更加咧係深入啲咧係去嘗試到乜嘢叫做共識民主決策嘅。咁咧就係佢開始嘅時候咧，會同我哋咧就講翻咧嗰個 consensus 嗰個 model 個 workshop 裏邊consensus model。然之後咧，佢會同我哋咧講解一下咧我哋今日佢會做嘅係乜嘢嘢。咁咧好希望大家咧一陣間咧就係攞出我哋去集會、去遊行、去討論嘅時候嗰啲熱情，咁咧就係盡量參與，好嘛？
又嗌兩句口號喎，跟住
係，咁跟住咧就係完咗成個嘅 workshop 咧，我哋翻嚟喺呢度咧，亦都係有一個 Q&A 咧，就係講全日嘅。但係當然之前咧就係陳建文教授會有啲回應先啦，好嘛 ？OK， 咁我哋咧就係時間差唔多啦，嚇 ，Nicole。
Hi. Okay, so we have an hour and 15 minutes to do 2 workshops and also a tutorial. So we're going to go really fast, probably. So let's talk about the origins of consensus. Consensus actually derives from indigenous American decision-making process, right? So its origins are very, very, very old, and it's been adjusted ever since that time into its current incarnation right now. But the roots of it and the principles behind it are from this long ago era. It's also used in a lot of faith-based communities today. Okay, so let's talk about consensus versus voting. In voting, you have 1, 2, or 3 options, or maybe more. They're predetermined. You don't really get a say in them, you're just kind of offered them. You don't get to add any input. If you lose in voting, right? You don't get to influence what happens, you're just done, you're silenced essentially. And this creates a competitive environment. So it's my guy or it's your guy and there's no in between. That's voting. With consensus, it works a little bit differently. The proposal is molded by the community. In the best forms of consensus making, the proposal is brought to the community and then the proposal belongs to the community. So they can mold it until it works for them. Space is created in consensus for conflict, for minority opinion. It's built in so it's included, right? It's inclusive to the minority. It's not one or the other. It's both together. So all voices are heard, even the smallest minority opinion gets heard out. And because of all of this, it's a cooperative process. We work together to come to a conclusion that works for everyone. Can you go to the next one? Yeah. Conflict and consensus. Okay, consensus is really great, as I mentioned, in holding conflict. It recognizes that conflict is not the enemy of peace, right? Every human interaction is going to have conflict at some point or another. You're not trying to avoid conflict. What you're trying to avoid is, hopefully, competition. is saying I'm superior and you're inferior. That's kind of the toxic language of voting. So a big of consensus is it manages conflict without creating competition, and it embraces conflict as something that's naturally occurring and part of being a human. So, okay, I already told you this. It's not based on competition, yet conflict is welcome. One really important thing about consensus, and we'll get into this a little bit later, is that it really, your consensus process is as good as you are able to educate the people you're making a decision with. And so, because of this, because it's listening to people and where they're coming from, it's very educational. If you don't understand what we're talking about, you don't just get presented two options and you just get to choose one, right? What's important about consensus is that you understand what's happening and also that you contribute to it and that it works for you and actually works for you. So this is very different from voting, right? It actually really wants you to understand, and especially if you're trying to build with people who are coming from a lot of different backgrounds, this is a huge educational opportunity to learn about whatever the proposal is and get informed about it, but also learn about other people and where they're coming from and what their experience is. And that's super transformational, and I think that's where real change comes from. No, not yet. It also allows for problem solving, right? Like, if you only get two options presented to you, then that's the extent of your creativity. You can't do anything more than that. In consensus, people can brainstorm endless solutions, right? It's open-ended. It's just about what is going to work for the most people. So you can really get creative and inventive, and you'll find that the solutions people come up with together are so much richer and so much more creative than the ones we come up with on our own. So one more thing for consensus, everyone's concerns are taken into account. These are big ones. A big plus of consensus is that everyone is heard, right? Like, and part of everyone being heard is that sometimes that can be really complex, but it's not every day people get the experience of really being consulted and really being listened to. And consensus builds that. It means your voice matters. And especially if you're part of a community and you're trying to contribute to something that is going to benefit the community, it is, I think there's no equal for it, really. There's really no equal for it. It's inclusive to many opinions, and it takes the best of everyone's ideas and synthesizes them together. And this is going to get into, I think the next slide is talking about facilitation, but that's what you do as a facilitator, is you are taking everyone's idea and trying to combine them in a way where it's better for everyone and it works for everyone and everyone can feel good about working towards it. Great, what a good segue. Okay, so the role of a facilitator. When you're facilitating, you're managing space, right? And you want to make sure people feel comfortable in that space and can communicate with each other in that space. So that is sometimes really difficult to do, but it kind of boils down to allowing people to talk to each other and be in conversation and making sure that they listen to each other. So sometimes this looks like repeating back to someone what they've said, just to make sure that everyone is on the same page about what's really happening. And also just endless patience. It takes a long time sometimes, not always, but you have to be extremely patient because you want to be flexible. People are coming from all over and all different experiences. You don't want to judge them, you don't want to make them feel bad or inferior, you want to respect them. And so these are really simple, but they're actually really difficult. What you also have to do is you have to be aware of the group dynamics and what's going on, and if people are getting tense or tired, or if they're interested, or if they need an energizer, or if people are about to break out in a fight. These are all things you really have to be paying attention to. You are given you're the person who's supposed to steer the meeting into a constructive solution. You're supposed to come up with the answers. You are the person who is shepherding the process and the ideas through, and you want to come up with something productive so everyone's time is respected. It doesn't always happen, but that's what you're trying to do. And if it doesn't happen, there's probably good reasons for that, and we'll get into that later. But that's kind of your main aim. And you also really want to be carefully listening to everyone who's in the group, because you're the person who's going to synthesize the ideas they're providing with the other ideas you've heard, so that you have a really good proposal ultimately. So that you flesh it out and make everyone feel heard. Okay. Tips for facilitating. Okay. So, I didn't even finish this thought. Okay. So, when you're creating spaces that feel safe to everyone, it's really important for facilitators to understand societal dynamics, right? Who are the voices that are always loud? Who are the voices that don't get heard? And trying to counter for that, right? Like in the space you're creating as a facilitator, you have the opportunity to transform. You could also not transform, but then don't expect to get a really good result out of that or a really good experience for most people. People don't want to come to a revolutionary space to feel silenced again. They want to feel heard, they want to feel counted because the other spaces aren't working for them. So what this means is keeping this always in mind when you're facilitating. When I was facilitating in Occupy, you would have extremely diverse people coming from, the Upper East Side, which is the richest area code in Manhattan, to Brooklyn, where they're very poor, and they would be in a room together trying to talk to one another, and some voices would feel entitled to the space and others wouldn't. And you as a facilitator have to counter for that. You have to try to encourage people who wouldn't normally speak up to speak up, and you have to be very gentle in letting people know the amount of time they have to speak if they are a person who gets to speak all the time. The most transformative organizing is organizing, in my mind, that happens from the margins, right? It's from the voices who aren't often heard, and we could learn so much from those people, and they must be involved. So that is part of the job of a facilitator that is usually often neglected. Be conscious of your energy. You're in front of a crowd, right? So your energy is being transferred to everyone who is in that crowd. And so you want to keep it friendly. You want to keep it determined. You want to keep the energy good. And so it's kind of exhausting to always be cheering and always believe in people, but it's great. It's great for them because then they aren't tired and you'll get to a better result if everyone's feeling good about where we're at. This is a big one. So just because you're a facilitator doesn't mean it's going to be easy, and doesn't mean people are going to necessarily like it, especially if there's like history and complicated things like that. So it's important to remember that your facilitation is based upon the group allowing itself to be facilitated, right? If the group doesn't want to be facilitated, if they don't want to work together, if they don't actually have anything in common, you can't facilitate that. And you're going to drive yourself crazy trying to. I've tried. It's horrible. So one thing we do is we ask the group, is it okay if I facilitate this conversation? And almost always it's a yes, but it reminds people that there's a relationship here, that I am doing this because you've said that it's okay that I facilitate this conversation. And so we're both bound to that agreement in some way. Consensus, yes, so this is important. Consensus is most important when it's something that affects the entire group, right? Where everyone's a stakeholder, where it matters to everyone. If it doesn't matter to everyone, it's maybe not something that needs to have a consensus process. In Occupy, we had consensus, but then we also had autonomy. So groups that wanted to self-organize and do things that really only concerned them could do it, and they wouldn't be dissuaded from doing that. They would be allowed to. So sometimes there will be like two different ideas, different ways we could go, and they can't mix like oil and water, and it's okay to recognize that as a facilitator. It's like, okay, you guys want to do this, and you guys want to do that, and that's okay, and why don't you guys talk about how you're going to do what you want to do, and you'll figure out what you want to do, and then we'll both be happy doing our own thing together, right? So that also could happen. And as a facilitator also, you're expected to not really have a horse in the race. This is hard to do, but nobody wants to have a facilitator that's leaning on one decision over another decision and really saying, well, you really should go this way, and I think this should happen, and it's not your job to provide your opinion. And it's hard because sometimes you want to, but you really have to try to stay neutral if you're going to be good at what you're doing. Your job is to listen to others and be patient and try to steer the full group. And if you can't do that, if you have to provide your opinion, you can take your facilitation hat off and give it to someone else and say, I can't facilitate this meeting because I am way too much of a stakeholder in it, and then provide your opinion. Because you should be allowed to provide your opinion even if you're a facilitator, right? Like, you're also a person who's come to this movement for good reasons and you care about it. And if you have something that's absolutely necessary to say, you should definitely say it. Okay, so creating community. One necessary thing that we did not figure out in Occupy until way too late, was that you have to be a stakeholder. You have to have some skin in the game. This has to be important to you. It has to, it has to concern you. We would be in the park and we would be facilitating these general assemblies, and we would have tourists who didn't live in the park come in, and we would be talking about something like getting bins for sanitation because, people need sanitation. Sorry, I'm getting signals. People need that kind of stuff for sanitation, and then people would be like, no, but you have to get eco-friendly fair trade bins. I'm just like, those don't exist, one, and you're slowing down a process where there are actual stakeholders who are direly, like, this is very important to them to have these bins. So you want to make sure people care about what's happening and that it affects them directly. Part of that, it defines membership, it kind of creates boundaries, and it also creates, a tool of accountability. If somebody starts breaking those community agreements, you have grounds to say, your behavior is making you not part of this community. I'm going to have to ask you to leave this decision-making process. I'm going to have to ask you to remove yourself. And then if you want to come back, we can talk about some future accountability process, but right now, you're not acting like a member of this community. And these are crucial, because if you don't have those people who are standing out there, they're going to come to all of your stuff and they're going to disrupt it. And you're not going to have any way to hold them accountable, because it's supposed to be open to everyone, right? So you have to think about this. You have to plan for it, or else you're going to get people who don't actually care if you succeed being part of your movement, who actually are bent on your failure being part of your movement. You will anyway, but these will help you distinguish and remove. So these are questions that are useful in thinking about what your community agreements should be and what they should be, basically. How do you want to act together in space? What kind of environment are you trying to create? What are the principles to which you aspire? What do they look like in action? This is 100% of what happened in Occupy. This is everything we did, because every action we did was hearkening back to principles we had, and there was a direct relationship. So this is a really good one. How should people try to talk to each other and listen to each other? And what are the boundaries of acceptable behavior? Are you going to tolerate people hitting each other, yelling over each other, being rude and disrespectful? Are you not? How is it flexible? These are all really important things to consider. And while I say that, you also want to make sure that your community agreements are not making your community homogenous, right? You want to have a diverse space. Everybody is capable of respecting each other. Everybody can listen to each other. Some people have a more difficult time listening to other people, but everyone is capable of it. You don't want to cut down on diversity, because if your boundaries are excluding people who do want to be involved, then you don't, that's not a good boundary to have. So I say think about the other questions, but also think about this. You want to get the balance right, and it's really important, and only you can figure out what that looks like. Okay, so now we're going to go into the consensus process. We're going to do an exercise, and we're going to do a mock proposal. There are a few things that I'm going to run through it and just talk about it really quickly. And there are a couple things that I would actually add to this. The first of which is somewhere up at the top, maybe after introductions. You would definitely want to ask for permission to facilitate the conversation. It's one of the first things you have to do, or you should do, because you want to make sure that you're in this together, and they want you to facilitate, and they're okay with you facilitating. So right after introductions, I would ask for consent to facilitate. Is it okay if I facilitate? And then always, every time you do the consensus process, you want to talk about the process. You don't know who's new to that meeting. You don't know whose first time it is. You want to make sure people have the same amount of information. So even if it's the 100th time you've heard something, it's the first time someone else has heard it. So you always want to repeat. You want to present the proposal or the issue, clarify what you're talking about, present the agenda even, right? Like if you have more than one proposal, you want to talk about each of them really briefly before you dive in. And you want to make sure everybody understands, right? So let's see. So once you have the proposals, then you go to group discussion. In this, you want to have clarifying questions. You want to make sure people understand what we're talking about. You want people to feel involved and like they have something to say. Then you talk about concerns, and then you resolve the concerns through friendly amendments. And those are both taken by the stack taker, and I'll get into roles in 1 second. And then you resolve the concerns, and at each of these points you could, call for consensus and come back to here. Usually in Occupy we would do it right here. We would not do it here, we would do it down here, so that people had their concerns heard and addressed. And then we would move to consensus. And before you move to consensus, you always want to restate the proposal with the added concerns and all of that before you get there. If you can't reach consensus, there are a couple of other things you can do. Stand aside, declare a block, make a breakout group of people who care strongly about the proposal and who are against the proposal, and make them work together to figure out something better to bring to the big group. Those are other ways you can go. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, and then another thing you can do is move to modified consensus. And we'll get into this a little bit later. In Occupy, we had 9/10 modified consensus. That doesn't work for everyone. And it didn't really work for us, and I can expand upon that. But modified consensus essentially is a vote. There are many stand-asides, because you've already done the process, right? It's not exactly like voting, because you've already done the work of educating, voicing the concerns, going through the whole attempt to make consensus happen. And if you still can't get it, sometimes you just have to come down to some decision-making factor. And so if we had the overwhelming majority, 9/10 of the population, decide that they were for something, then we would call modified consensus. Consensus is a process, right? If you don't end up in consensus, if you get modified consensus, what's special about it is everything you've done up until that point. Getting consensus is great, it's really awesome, but the whole process of it is what makes it unique. So, okay, now we're gonna go into the roles of facilitation. So we're gonna do a mock proposal right now, and I'm gonna have help from these people over here. We're gonna do a proposal that, let's say, someone has suggested, and that proposal is going to be something dim sum. The proposal is going to be, we're going to eat dim sum tonight, all of us. That's the proposal. So I'm proposing, one of you has proposed, we're all going to have dim sum tonight. This is just for practice. This is probably, you won't be talking about things like this or make everyone eat the same thing, but So we're going to work through this. There are many roles in the facilitation team. There's a facilitator. Usually, it's great if there are like two because it's really tiring and sometimes it can be really exhausted. There's a note taker. You want to take notes on everything you do in movements for transparency, for posterity, because people look to movements. People want to learn. Future movements want to figure out what you did and what you were thinking and how decisions were made, and it helps with transparency down the road. You want to document everything you do, always. A stack taker. Let's talk about who's going to be our stack taker. Okay, great. Who's our note taker? Well, we're not going to have a note taker because this is not a real exercise. Yeah. The same time? Okay. So I'll go and then you go? Okay. So stack taker, that is the person who is going to make the list. This is a complicated way of saying this is a person who makes a list of who needs to speak, of when we ask for clarifying questions or concerns, this person is gonna make that list. And what we did in Occupy, and what I encourage you to do, is, are you trying to translate all of this?
Just
no.
very simple 啊。
Oh, okay.
即係講一講咧，其實佢而家講到咧就話究竟喺嗰個咧所謂 facilitation 啊，即係促進大家一齊討論嘅時候有啲咩嘅角色啊咁。咁第一種就係梗係呢個促進員啦，第二係寫筆記㗎啦，第三個 stack taking 咧就係列出咧究竟有啲乜嘢要喺嗰度傾嘅，因為大家 flow 咗之後咧，咁就有人要幫手。
但係其實咧嗰、個所謂嘅 stack taker 咧係一個咧記錄一個表，即係邊個講嘢先，邊個講嘢後，又或者咧其實咧Nicole之前都有同我哋 brief 嘅時候講咧，其實咧係要留意下有冇啲人係比較少發言啊，或者佢係屬於某一啲嘅你可以即係留意到佢係一個比較邊緣少少嘅社會地位嘅時候，可能咧就要係自己去調整一下嗰個 list 咯。 你要邊個講嘢先，邊個講嘢後？
咁咧，同埋咧，佢仲要係觀察住咧，究竟即係究竟大家個討論裏邊咧有冇啲咩問題嘅？例如可能係咪淨係拱晒啲女人去前邊啊，或者 F 馬去前嘅人去前邊啊？定係究竟發生緊咩事啊？對於整個嗰個運作咧，要有一個仔細啲嘅觀察嘅。
So the next one is, did you go into the side? Okay. So vibes watcher, this is a very important position. It basically, oh, did you talk about it? Okay, you're right there. This is very important. Essentially, you're just looking to make sure that the crowd is doing well. If they need an energizer, if they need to like take a breath, if they need a song to like motivate and get everyone's spirits back up, you do an icebreaker, whatever. Making sure everyone's in a good mood.
即係有人需要觀察住個組啦，係咪已經你哋都唔係，你哋都仲仍然好有 energy 嘅，咁定係瞓晒覺啊，定係點咧？咁到時咧就要即係唱下歌啊，或者做一啲嘢，令到啲人醒翻晒啊，咁樣樣咯。
Okay, and finally, this is the timekeeper. And this has to be a person that everybody likes because they're going to be cutting you off, essentially. So this is the person who's like, you're out of time. Because we have to respect everyone's time, it's really good to make sure that we have communal understandings about how long we're going to speak for. That said, be flexible, right? If somebody's having trouble getting an idea out, if someone's not used to speaking in front of crowds, you want to have a little bit of flexibility.
好，咁就係介紹啦，因為即係個討論時間可能會好長嘅，要 agree 咗大家究竟用幾多時間去傾啊，咁就會清楚啲啦，大家。
Yeah, I think we can go to the next one. Next slide. So I'm just going really quickly through this. If you notice everything we've done so far in this formal consensus process, I'm going to write down here. And these are things you should do every time you're facilitating, just because you want to make sure, once again, everyone's on the same page.
Let me go to the hand signs.
Yeah, so right now we're going to go through hand signs. So, okay, so what we did, Okay. Oh, feedback. So we use nonverbal communication because in groups that are very large, you can't have everyone screaming over each other. So these are ways to express how we feel without having to say them. So if somebody says something awesome and we really jive with it and they're like, yeah man, you're awesome, I feel great about that, we would go like this.
即係呢個咧係同意啦，即係話我哋好贊成你嘅説法啦咁樣，因為咧喺嗰個溝通裏邊啊，即係大家傾嘢裏邊咧，就因為避免咗咧，譬如我同你搭聲啊，我哋同時都想出聲嘅時候咧，咁就冇機會表達到噶嘛，咁所以咧就會咧好多時係用一啲所謂 non-verbal 嘅 hand size 即係一啲手勢咧去表達自己嘅，得唔得？咁我哋介紹下呢個，大家咧可以一齊做喎，好唔好啊？ 即係有神奇力量嘅，大家試下做先，同埋令到啲行動比較有趣啊嚇，大家嘅討論比較有趣 ，relax 啲嘅，好同意咧就可以喐㗎啦啲手指。
So this is where we feel good. If we feel so if we're doing a consensus, we're doing consensus, and we're asking how you feel about a proposal. In that instance, you can, if you feel badly, you can say no, I don't like that proposal. That's down twinkles.
好啦，即係唔同意嘅。
Which is pretty intuitive. An important distinction, right? Up twinkles, you can do whenever. If you said something great and I'm like, yeah, I feel that. Up twinkles, always, right? Now, if you said something that I don't like, I'm not going to go like this in your face because that's rude and we don't want to do that, right? These are not good vibes to be putting out there, so we don't ever try to direct these at people. This is only for, not even people who say ideas, just if we're asked our opinion, no, I don't like it. And in the middle, like, I don't know how to feel. Okay.
即係愛嚟俾，即係人哋問你嘅時候，你去回應人，而唔係用呢個手勢咧去話俾你我唔同意你啊咁樣，得唔得？唔係愛嚟攻擊嘅，得唔得？唔係 weapons 嚟嘅，而係到咧問嘢嘅時候，大家你同唔同意啊？咁就用呢個手勢去表達咯，得唔得？
So next is in the middle. It's if we don't know, we're not sure how we feel.
唔係好知嘅時候咧，就用呢個嘢去表達啦。
Okay, so the next signals that we have, so this three, they make sense. So point of process. Point of process is this signal.
究竟我哋傾到去邊啊？其實嗰個係，即係唔係好 sure 嘅，我哋去到邊咧？
Point of process, okay. So what this signal means is that we're off process. It means a couple of things, right? Like, I don't know what we're talking about, where are we in the process, or maybe I have a process suggestion about how to get us out of the situation. So it's kind of to do with if the situation gets tricky or muddled, to kind of steer us back on track. So if I'm supposed to be talking about dim sum, and I start talking about, like teriyaki, right? Then point of process. Wait, why are you talking about that? You're supposed to be talking about this. Get back on schedule, right?
即係翻返去 clarify， 即係去澄清究竟咧，我哋而家係傾緊個咩問題，去翻嗰個主題嗰度嘅時候咧，就用一個咁嘅手勢啦。咁咧，我哋通常咧就唔會咁做嘅，佢話俾你聽，即係嗰幾個手指咧，即係會放翻即係唔會放落嚟係咁樣嘅，因為咧喺佢哋嗰個社會裏邊，佢琴晚解釋俾你聽，呢個手勢咧就係 vagina 咁解嘅，咁咧，所以咧佢就話要咁樣。
So yeah, there's many. Okay, so yeah, you also don't want to throw that at a person either. And if you have a point of process, it's up to the facilitator to call on you. If you have a point of process, it's up to the facilitator to call on you and address your point of process.
即係咧，就如果有出現咗頭先嗰個話啊，我想翻返去我哋而家傾嗰個主題咧，其實咧係由嗰個 facilitator 嗰個促進員咧，其實去解決嘅，係啦。咁可能佢會話啊，你等等先，我哋再去回應你嗰個問題咁樣。
即係示意俾嗰個
你係講俾佢知道有呢個問題你想提出。
So this is a point of information. Just this means I have some important, relevant information that is going to contribute to this conversation right now.
即係想講啲嘢，有啲資訊想講嘅係可以即係貢獻到喎，喺個組度貢獻到嘅一種資訊喎咁樣。咁你咧就第一隻手指啦。
So if I'm talking about a meeting and I said it means at 4,
呢一隻啊嚇，
and
會
you
亂嚟啊？呢度我睇到嗰度想唔知舉啲乜嘢。
and you know the meeting is at 5, and you can say point of information. The meeting is at 5. So okay, the next one, wrap it up. So you know how some people sometimes just talk and talk and talk and they don't get to the point? That's why we have this.
即係請佢快啲去翻主題嗰度啦，咁樣係咯，但唔係怪責喎，係邀請佢咁樣做喎。
And we always preface
positive 有微笑㗎
this by saying, you know, I love you, I think you're a great person, but please.
我愛你啊！等等，你喺度一路講緊嘅時候，我哋好需要呢啲嘢，我諗我哋啲討論裏邊真係係啦，微笑咁樣邀請佢，
With a smile,
提醒佢啊
lovingly. So okay, this last one, this is important. So yeah, a block. Okay, a block is this signal. I know it feels bad, right? This does not mean I disagree with the proposal. This means I have a moral view, I have a moral objection to this proposal. It's not just against my principles, it's against our principles. I block it, right? I would leave whatever we're doing together because I disagree with this so much. It's a very serious objection.
係一個非常大嘅一個即係唔同意嚟嘅。咁咧就係即係可能要超越到去一個即係譬如可能一啲你信念上高嘅問題，而家討論緊嘅或者嗰個提議咧係超越咗或者係唔符合你嘅一個嘅道德標準啊，即係道德你明我講咩㗎啦？即係你唔好用錯啲道德嘅字眼，咁即係。咁即係呢一方面嘅嘢，要係咁大嘅，你先會用呢個 block 嘅嘢。咁一樣啦，你又係示意俾咧促進員知道，然後令佢咧就係一齊去處理呢件事，得唔得？即係咁樣又唔係去咧就 stop 大家所有人討